Okay, welcome everybody to another installation of the UCLA Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Speaker Series. We meet every Monday during the academic year. All of them are on Zoom through the end of spring at least. And we also post most of the talks on our YouTube channel, which is all one word, UCLA Beck. The website is bec.ucla.edu. You probably know about it already if you're on here. But for those who might be new, you can go to the Get Involved tab on the Beck website, and there's a listserv, and you can enter your email, and you will receive all of the announcements for the talks. And there's also a way to unsubscribe if you go to that part of the page. Before I introduce today's speaker, let me just give you a preview of next week. Our speaker next week is Dr. Manveer Singh, who's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse, France. And Manveer's talk will be called The Nature and Origins of Religious Superattractors. So please join us for that if you're interested next week. And today, it is my great pleasure to welcome back our friend Paul Smaldino, Professor Paul Smaldino from Cognitive Science at UC Merced, a fellow UC colleague. And Paul's talk will be called The Evolution of Covert Signaling in Diverse Societies. Please join me in welcoming Paul. If you'd like to unmute yourself for a second. Welcome, Paul. Do you want to share your screen and?
All right. Yeah. Okay.
Go for it.
Should I just start?
Yeah, go for it. Yep.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks, Clark, for that introduction and for inviting me. Thanks, everyone, for coming. It's always a pleasure to engage with this group. So I'm really happy to be here today and talk about this work. So this is a project I've been kind of tooling around for a while. It actually has some pretty deep UCLA connections, so as I'll get into. The talk is called The Evolution, well, here it's called The Evolution of Covert Signaling, and then there was more in the talk I sent out, but I forgot to change the title slide, so this is it. In talking about the evolution of human behavior and social evolution, et cetera, there's a lot of focus on cooperation. And I think rightly so, right? Cooperation is super important. We work together in all kinds of ways, and figuring out how cooperation evolves and is maintained is a big deal. But a lot of that is focused on sort of the free rider problem. How do you get cooperators instead of non-cooperators? How do you avoid selfish individuals from exploiting cooperative individuals working together? Which is an important problem, but once you solve that problem, there's still a second problem or multiple other problems, right? Which is coordination and partner choice. So not all cooperators are equal, right? You might have two people equally willing to work with you, and they're just, for a variety of reasons, are going to be certain individuals that are better. Either they're more capable, or they're better suited to the task, or they get along better with you. So here I've sort of, you can debate on the merits of this, but I've called this the Hermione dilemma, right? Where Hermione needs to fight the Dark Lord Voldemort, and she can choose to help her either Harry Potter here, lost in the world of miniature equine aficionada, or Neville Longbottom. Now, the issue here, right, is neither of these characters are bad people. Neither of them are defectors. They're both cooperators. So it is not about avoiding cooperators. It is finding the right person to interact with and cooperate with. So the more general issue, right, is that once an individual is willing to cooperate, they also have to find a partner or a group with whom to cooperate, and there are a lot of important considerations. So we need common ground, having a similar background, experiences, traditions, shared norms, and values can help coordinate interests, having a shared intentionality and a group mindset, empathy with others' feelings and experiences, and different roles for many different tasks. And I've listed all these things because these are sort of different things that different fields or subfields have focused on. And I think they're all really important to cooperation. And I'd like to posit that these are all related to what we usually think of as identity, right? What it is to be you and not someone else. Now, social identity is a squishy topic in the way it's usually talked about. In psychology or in related fields, it's often talked about in terms of phenomenology or self-conceptualization, which is, not unimportant. But I think if we're taking an evolutionary perspective, it forces us to think instrumentally, right? Which is, I think, one of the main strengths of the evolutionary perspective, right? What is identity for? And I think a big part of what identity is for is as a signal to tell others what you are like and what you are not like. So here's just one particular study that I like, done by a couple of marketing psychologists at Stanford, where they asked students to think about product adoption. And when they were asked to think of them in terms of identity and told them to rate some MP3 player, which was a thing, not only just 13 years ago, MP3 players were a thing. And they were told this was rated highly either by individuals in general or business executives, which is a group that the students found dissimilar. So under the identity prime, but not the functionality prime, students rated it lower when they were told that an outgroup rated it highly, right? More generally, right, we all are aware that identity is a signal, and people signal their identity often very vocally, right? So here are very extreme examples. On the right is like the most extreme. I can't even believe that that's a thing, but it's a thing. On the left, this is, if you can see it, this is a minivan that has things like Hillary 2016 and the Coexist bumper sticker. And this is a real car, and I put it up specifically because there was a news story which the woman driving that car was run off the road because a man in Missouri pulled a gun on her and sort of waved it around at her while they were driving on the freeway and railed her off the road, right? So clearly identity is a signal, and that can be used in positive ways and negative ways. I want to just briefly mention this. It's not going to be the focus of my talk, but currently, right, identity being a signal and sort of markers of identity as signals are really important for things like adoption of preventative measures in disease prevention. So there's a lot of political polarization in things like mask wearing, for example. Masks are interesting because they're extremely overt. You can't sort of hide the fact that you're wearing a mask, and we find that there's very strong polarization in who chooses to wear masks and how people feel about the masks, and this matters. I have a study, or sort of a series of studies ongoing with Jamie Holland-Jones at Stanford. We have an epidemic model with couple behavioral and disease contagion that's under review now. And the basic thing we find is that if there's outgroup aversion in behavioral adoption, when members of the outgroup adopt something that makes members of the in-group less likely to adopt it, then you get basically a lot worse outcomes and a lot more disease. And this is exacerbated when there's also between group homophily, so members are more likely to interact with members of their own group rather than out-group members. What I want to focus on more today is sort of a more general idea of this instrumental function of identity as a signal for assortment and for cooperation or the lack of cooperation, right? So obviously there's tremendous cultural variation both in the world today and throughout human history. And I think this matters in the way that we have to think about identity. Right? So there isn't just the way our psychology has evolved to think about and present identity, and that's all we need to deal with. We need to deal with the fact that the cultural and social context shapes the adaptive functions and strategies for identity signaling. So now I'm going to start talking about a model. And then I'm going to loop back around and I'll present some empirical work, which is sort of pretty new on this topic. So the main problem, right, is that people are different, which is not a problem in and of itself. It's a good thing. But if we're looking to assort, and we're looking to assort on, let's say, I'm just going to focus on assorting on similarity, so shared norms, values, experiences, etc. And I'm sort of ignore for now assorting on differences for things like division of labor. If we're looking to assort, what we want to do is assort with people who are like us in whatever way, and avoid people who are unlike us. Right? The problem is that most times it's not necessarily obvious who is like you and who isn't. And if you just look at someone's face, you can't always tell who's going to be, they're going to like all the same bands you like, or, feel the same way about fried rice or, socialized healthcare or not, right? So what do you do? So by far the most studied solution to this is ethnic markers or tags or social markers, right? If we have some sort of signal that says, this is the kind of person I'm like, then this allows us to assort. Everyone wearing purple hats can interact with other people wearing purple hats. Everyone wearing green hats can interact with other people wearing green hats, and everything is awesome. We get a nice bonus for coordination. So this is a good thing. But it has a side effect, right? Which is that it also causes us to burn bridges with members of the outgroup. If I wear a green hat and I use green hats to assort with other people who are green hat wearers, and all green hat wearers share something in common, then I also let everyone know who wears a different color hat that I'm not like them. I'm a green hat person, not a purple hat person, which gives the purple hats a reason to avoid me and me a reason to avoid them. Now, in some contexts, that's totally fine and potentially adaptive. But even if you just focus on variation, just zooming in among the green hats or the purple hats, let's take purple hats, not everyone is the same, right? Even within a group, there's still variation. And by focusing on within group assortment, the issue here is that sometimes you have to interact or cooperate with a member of your group because they're a member of your group, even if they're not like you in a lot of meaningful ways. So this is a problem for sort of an all or none, black or white, left or right kind of ethnic markers scenario. Ethnic markers are really good for assortment on norms between groups, but it eliminates any cooperation between groups. Within groups, it would be nice to be able to assort on norms when possible, so that we're not just interacting at random, but acknowledging that sometimes it's not good to burn bridges with people who you might have to work with. And this is the kind of dichotomy that I'm going to focus on. So what would be nice, right, is to have a way to send high information signals to similar individuals so that similar individuals can say, aha, they're like me. I'm going to work with them. That's great. But dissimilar individuals can just sort of not necessarily know anything. They treat me like someone who they don't have any specific information with. We don't bring up any sensitive topics, and we can keep on working together. So this is this kind of signaling is what I'm going to call covert signaling. And I'm now just going to mention a few kind of examples in the world of this. This whole conversation, or me thinking about covert signaling in particular, got started with conversations I had with Tom Flamson, who many of you know, and Tom's work with both Clark and Greg here. So Tom always said that if he had written a book about the encryption theory of humor, it would be called "You Had to Be There." So this Jimmy Buffett record is in his honor. So the idea here is that humor functions as a kind of covert signal because language has multiple layers of meaning, and being able to sort of reliably make someone else laugh is a honest signal of similarity. And so they've done some studies, so showing having prior knowledge of a situation increases the rating of a joke as funny in both US and Brazilian samples. And among Brazilian collective farmers, social network closeness predicted similarity in joke ratings. So people who you're closer with tend to have similar senses of humor with, which gives some support to this idea. But it's not just humor, right? Things don't have to be funny to be covert signals. There's lots of ways to signal covertly. So fashion can be a kind of covert signal. I really like, there's a study by Berger and Ward looking at what they called, I think, inconspicuous consumption. So fashion, the idea is that people who are really into fashion don't want others to know exactly the brands that they're wearing or carrying, because sort of more subtle cues are more informative, is a way to distinguish people who are other people who are in the know. So this is a quote from their paper. While subtly marked products are misrecognized by most observers and thus seem like less effective signals in general, people with domain-specific cultural capital, i.e. insiders, actually prefer them because they provide differentiation from the mainstream and should facilitate interaction with others in the know. So here's this top one is a Coach bag. This is sort of a conspicuous signal because it says Coach. And this bottom is by a brand named Tory Burch, which is more of an insider brand. And the bottom bag costs twice as much as the top bag. All right. Also, covert signaling could be useful for sort of invisible minorities. So people with differences who that are not necessarily obvious to others, for whom it would be important to meet others like them, but dangerous or costly in other ways for them to out themselves to people who are not necessarily like them. So I like, there's this neat sort of photo essay book by Fisher called Gay Semiotics, looking at sort of men's gay fashion in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco in the 1970s, right? Documenting sort of subtle cues that gay men would use to identify each other. There's not a ton of great empirical research on this, but there is one study I found indicating that gay men are more accurate than straight men in identifying other gay men just by videotape without any sound. And then finally, covert signaling can be really important for something like political dissidence, right? If you are under, let's say, an oppressive or totalitarian regime, identifying like-minded individuals is going to be really beneficial, but outing yourself to non-sympathetic sympathetic individuals could be highly costly. So all this sort of sets the backdrop for what I'm calling a theory of covert signaling. Right? Covert signaling is the transmission of information that is accurately received by its intended audience, but obscured when perceived by others. The first paper on this was co-written by Tom Flamson and Richard McElreath, and published in 2018. So this covert signaling here contrasts with overt signaling, in which honest signals of identity are widely broadcast. So examples are things like humor, flirting, fashion, various shibboleths, political dog whistles can be considered a covert signaling, and gaydar. So since this is an evolutionary-minded audience, I'm going to ask an evolutionary question, which is, under what conditions will selection, and I'm mostly thinking cultural selection, favor the evolution of covert signaling? So to answer this question, I'm going to present a model, actually two models, but I'm kind of variations on the same model. The model works like this. There's 4 stages. Signals are transmitted. Receivers form attitudes based on those signals. Individuals assort for cooperative task, for some cooperative task using their attitudes, and then payoffs from those tasks lead to differential fitness outcomes or payoff outcomes. So you can think of fitness either, I mean, if you like, you can imagine this as a genetic trait, but certainly in a sort of success biased copying, it also works. And that's mostly what I'm imagining. So to unpack that a little more, right? In signal transmission, individuals signal either overtly or covertly. All signals are a little bit noisy. Overt signals are received by a proportion R of similar individuals and also a proportion, big R, of dissimilar individuals. Everybody receives an overt signal, or potentially does. Covert signals are more noisy because they're encrypted, so fewer people receive them, but only similar individuals receive them. Dissimilar individuals ignore them and don't get any identity information out of the covert signaling. And this is a strong assumption, and imagine relaxing it a little bit for the sake of the model. I'm assuming this. Once individuals receive their information, they form attitudes. Now, here's something I think I'll just pause and say that a benefit of modeling is it does force you to work through all the assumptions of the idea, right? And so when we first worked out this, or started thinking about this idea, we didn't think about the receiver strategies at all. And only realizing that if everybody is signaling covertly, and you consistently don't receive any information from someone, that should be information that you could use to tell you that they're probably dissimilar from you. So we focus also not just on the evolution of signaling strategies, but on the evolution of receiving strategies. So receivers in this model can either be generous, in which they are neutral toward everyone about whom they have no information. If they receive information that they are dissimilar from someone, they dislike them. If they receive information that they're similar to someone, they like them. They're generous because they give everyone a chance. They just are neutral toward outsiders. Churlish receivers, on the other hand, dislike everyone by default, unless they actually receive positive information of similarity. All right, so once there's information in the world about identity, they assort. And so in the model, we vary homophily, which is the ability for similar individuals to successfully assort. So when homophily is high, people who like each other can easily meet up. When homophily is low, people interact mostly at random. So when homophily is high, not only do people who like each other meet up at higher than average chance, but also people who dislike each other are better able to avoid each other. So homophily is basically the strength of the, how strong is the ability to use the attitudes to interact preferentially with those you like and avoid people you dislike. The assumption is that similar pairs get a higher payoff than dissimilar pairs, and that being disliked imposes a cost, and being a mutual disliked imposes an additional cost. So it's better to interact with someone who you are similar to, because you have shared norms, values, etc. And if you're interacting with someone you're dissimilar to, that imposes a cost if you know it. So this is basically the payoff. There's a default of 1. If you're similar, you get a bonus S. That's the coordination bonus, you can think of it. But also, if one person dislikes the other, that imposes a cost D on the interaction, because disliking hampers coordination, and mutual disliking is thought to further hamper coordination. Okay. After all this happens and agents interact with a bunch of others, there's selection. And individuals with higher payoffs reproduce their strategies, both their signaling strategy and their receiving strategy. And we analyzed this idea with 2 different models. The first one in the 2018 paper is with an analytical model using replicator dynamics, and more recently is with a sort of more fancy agent-based model using, if you're familiar with evolutionary modeling, a Moran process. And that I'll get to that in a sec. So the analytical model generates, we can make these cool trajectory plots. And this is just some examples of the kind of dynamics that can emerge in the model. And I just wanted to point this out. So first of all, notice, and I'll get more on this in a sec, that so here the x-axis is the proportion of individuals who are signaling covertly, and the y-axis is churlish receiving. It's the probability that no signal leads to disliking. And notice that there are sort of 2, the first 2 show that there are attractors can emerge in sort of 2 corners, right? The churlish receiving and overt signaling, or the generous receiving, and covert signaling. And we can also get mixed equilibria in the model. I'm not going to talk any more about the analytical model because all the main results are basically recovered in the agent-based model, and the agent-based model also allows us to do some other neat things that are difficult in the analytical model. So I want to talk about that. And this is work done with my grad student, Matt Turner. That paper is under review now, but the preprint is up on Social Archive for those who are interested. So here, again, the agents have strategies for signaling, either overt or covert, and receiving, generous or churlish. How are agents similar or different? Well, we're not assuming that there are two types of people in the population. We're actually assuming that there is a wide variety. People differ in many ways and can differ continuously. So agents are defined not by a single group identity, but by a vector of k traits. For simplicity, we made these traits binary. So you either have it or you don't. You know, you either like hip hop or you hate hip hop. You either love socialism or you hate socialism. You either love ice cream or you hate ice cream, whatever it is. The default will be that similarity means sharing at least half your traits, but I'm going to vary that assumption as well. And then reproduction through a Moran process, which just means that every time step, one agent dies and is replaced by another agent with a proportion, with a probability proportional to their payoff. And there's some mutations, so the strategies can change. So in analyzing this model, the first result we get is this, right? Is that covert signaling evolves when homophily is low and the cost of being disliked is high, right? I think this makes a lot of sense, right? First of all, if the cost is disliking, if there's no cost to being disliked, then it doesn't matter so much, and you should signal overtly. Now, I want to highlight this, right? Overt signaling is more efficient. More people receive it, and they receive, both types of individuals receive it, so that similar individuals are better able to find you and dissimilar individuals are better able to avoid you. Covert signaling is noisier, but it avoids the risk of being disliked by someone who's dissimilar from you. So this is the trade-off, right? If homophily is high, if we can always assort with the people we want to assort with, overt signaling is always favored. But if that's not the case, if at least some of the time you have to interact with people at random, covert signaling is favored, especially if being disliked is costly. We also see that covert signaling co-evolves with generous receiving, and this makes sense too, right? If everyone is a churlish receiver, covert signaling is not a good idea because they already dislike you, so there's no benefit to avoiding being disliked. Covert signaling evolves when receivers are generous, and this makes sense, but what we see in the model, and doesn't necessarily have to happen, but it does happen in the model, is that generous receiving does in fact evolve and co-evolves with covert signaling. So the top graph is just the same kind of heat plot with the same axes, but here's the density of churlish receivers in all these conditions. And the bottom is a scatter plot from all these simulations showing that in the times where covert signaling evolves, also churlish receiving does not evolve. Here's, I think, where it gets more interesting. I told you I was going to vary S, right? This is the similarity threshold. So S is the fraction of traits we have to have in common to be considered similar. So if S is low, that means that as long as we have one or two things in common, that's fine, and we can be considered similar. And if S is high, that means we have to share most things for us to be considered similar. But I think that what I'm trying to argue here is also we can use the similarity threshold as a way of conceptualizing diversity, right? When a population is very diverse, that means there's many kinds of people in the community and many traits that matter. And so therefore, most people will be dissimilar, and we need to have enough things in common to really be considered similar and get a coordination benefit. If a population is fairly homogeneous, then most of the traits we have in common are not that important, And as long as we share a few things, or most things, there's already sort of maybe a background amount of coordination that we can assume. And as long as we have a few things in common, we can be considered similar. So what we show in the model is that in more diverse communities, covert signaling is more favored, right? If most people are dissimilar from you, and therefore a random individual is likely to be different from you, then covert signaling evolves. Then signaling should be covert. Whereas if most people are probably like you, a random person is like you, signaling is more likely to be overt. Now, this is a general result about diversity, and this is the same in here. Diversity is the same for everyone, right? Every individual has the same probability of finding a similar individual or a dissimilar individual. But often that's not the case, right? Populations are structured often into majority and minority groups. And majority groups, most people are similar to them because that's what it means to be in the majority, right? Minority groups, most people are dissimilar from them because that's what it means to be in the minority. So we operationalize this, and we actually in the paper, in the supplement, we ran additional experiments with varying the number of traits that individuals have up from 3 to 21, but all the results I'm showing you are with 9. So what we do is we imagine two classes of individuals, majority and minority. Majority individuals, their first 4 traits are fixed at 1, and minority individuals, their first 4 traits are fixed at 0. So that means if the threshold is 50%, that means you have to have 5 in common to be similar. So any two majority individuals are very likely to be similar, but not guaranteed. And any two minority individuals are very likely to be similar, but not guaranteed. And any majority and minority individuals are very likely to be dissimilar, but there is a small chance that they will be similar, right? And here we ran experiments where 90% of the population was in the majority, 10% are in the minority, and we further assumed that strategies are copied between types. So members of the minority adopt their strategy from other members of the minority. Members of the majority adopt their strategies from other members of the majority. And what we find is that covert signaling is favored among minority groups. So in all cases, or in most cases where there's any variation, the prevalence of covert signaling is higher in the minority group than in the majority group for the same situation, for the same threshold, similarity threshold S, for the same level of homophily, for the same costs, right? So here, these plots are showing homophily varying from 0 to 1, right? Covert signaling is stronger when homophily is low, but it's stronger in the minority group. In the top graph, it's kind of interesting. This is when S equals 3, so or 0.3 rather. So that means most individuals, you just need to share 3 of your traits with someone, or a third of your traits with someone. Yeah, so 3 of your traits, and you're similar, right? In that case, the selection on minority individuals is just much stronger at all times. Because majority individuals are almost always going to find someone like them regardless. So selection on their signaling strategy is weak. And what's interesting is you get this flip, right? When homophily is extremely strong, minority individuals now signal overtly because it's more important for them to find someone who's like them. And if homophily is strong enough, then as long as they can know about someone else who's like them, they're going to be able to assort. So there's stronger selection for them to signal overtly, but only when homophily is very strong, and in general, the diversity is fairly low. That's all I have for the model. I think that this tells us, well, I think it tells us a lot of things. It's sort of very broad stroke interpretation or lesson that I've learned, which is something that's pretty obvious to anyone who studies communication or psycholinguistics, is that is that context matters, right? So this is like the entire field of pragmatics is based on this assumption, right? Communication often carries multiple diverging lines of meaning beyond what is superficially being expressed. So if we want to know what's being expressed, there needs to be some knowledge of context. And this is actually what allows covert signaling to happen, is that there's asymmetries in what people know and therefore how they interpret communication. The covert signaling, understanding covert signaling requires relationship-specific pragmatics to understand what's being said. So I'm going to now talk a little bit about a domain in which there's very little subtlety, or one might think, which is Twitter. So these are all tweets that people sent out on a particular day. And for those of you who are film buffs, you may, sort of get a sense of what's happening here, right? Remember that scene in Lord of the Rings where that old dude tries to burn his still living son and the little hobbit is like, no, you can't do this. Remember that scene in The Two Towers where Theoden is watching the Uruk-hai surround Helm's Deep? Remember that scene in Deliverance, what the hillbillies did to the city folk? I just thought of that right now for some reason, so weird. Hey, remember that scene in Titanic when the lights go out and everyone realizes no one's going to rescue them? These all seem like they're kind of disconnected, but they were all sent on November 9th, 2016, which is the day after Election Day, 2016. And people are trying to signal a particular emotion that they're feeling without necessarily expressing something overtly or something that's going to, come at potential social costs. And I just searched Twitter for that date and the phrase "remember that scene," right? But Twitter provides an interesting context for studying communication because it is extremely public, right? It's all the communication is being made in a way that everyone can see it. But we also know that sometimes Twitter communication can be extremely costly, like people lose their jobs for things that they tweet. I started talking about, and actually, I don't know if he's here today, but the initial idea for this study that I'm about to present came from a conversation I had a couple years ago with Michael Che in UCLA political science. So thank you, Michael. I don't know if you're here, but thank you. I want to talk about this study that is ongoing. We are writing up the first paper now. We're getting ready to do our second round of data collection this spring. So this is a project with Mirta Galisik, Tamara Vanderdos, and Zachary Donovan. The first two are at SFI. Zach is at Indiana. So the motivating question here is to see if people actually do strategically alter their signaling behavior in ways that are consistent with the covert signaling model that I just presented. And so we studied this on Twitter. This was really hard. I don't know how good this study is. Most of my training is as a modeler, and most of my background is in modeling. And what I have learned is trying to design a study to effectively test a model is not easy. So hats off to everyone who does complicated empirical work. So here, first we got a bunch of tweets because we needed tweets that were good candidates for overt and covert signals. Now, that's really hard already because by definition, a covert signal is something that only insiders are able to recognize. So how do you find that if you're not an insider? I think there are probably a number of candidate ways, but what we did was we identified certain seed accounts, so Twitter accounts that followed multiple either far right or far left sites. So people who are partisans and politically engaged. We then collected tweets from accounts who followed those seed accounts and looking at people whose networks were either homogeneous, meaning they all tended to also follow right-wing or left-wing, or accounts from the same side, or heterogeneous, so they followed a mix. And then we collected about 8,000 tweets during a 6-week period this fall. We then got a bunch of participants on MTurk. Insert caveats about MTurk here. Then the behavioral experiment takes on 2 phases, right? The first is that participants evaluated the tweets. And here's where we identified candidate overt and covert tweets. And I'll say a bit about that in a sec. And then once we had our candidates, we then did another experiment where participants used those tweets in order to communicate for payoffs, cash payoffs to groups that were mixed. So I'll unpack that right now. So phase one, these are here are some examples. So overt tweets are those that were viewed positively by partisans of the same side and negatively by partisans on the opposite side. So this was, they're all from the fall. This was happening right around the time of the presidential debates and the Amy Coney Barrett hearings. So just to put these in context. So this is someone, an overt tweet on the left, right? No justice, no peace, hashtag say her name, hashtag Breonna Taylor. Here, this is an overt right-wing tweet. I was born free and I will die free no matter what. Hashtag Second Amendment, hashtag America, hashtag Christian, hashtag Constitution, hashtag freedom, hashtag pro-life, hashtag Civil War II. Woo! Here are some candidate covert tweets. There were a lot fewer of these, I think for obvious reasons. I mean, Twitter may or may not be the best place to look for covert signals, but we did, and we did find some that fit the profile that they were viewed positively by partisans and non-negatively by opposite size partisans. So here are some examples. This is a left-wing covert tweet. Mike Pence, pretty fly for a white guy, hashtag Pence fly, hashtag VP debates 2020. Many of you will recognize what's going on there. Here's a right-wing one. It's time to pull the 47 USC paragraph section 230 card, hashtag stop censorship, hashtag big tech censorship. When I saw this, I didn't know what it was initially. So this has actually been in the news more recently since this was done. But USC section 230 is part of the Federal Communications Bill or law that which grants protection for private blocking and screening of offensive material. So what it actually does is remove liability from for tech companies for things people say on their platform. But some people think that it means that tech companies shouldn't be allowed to remove offensive content. And so this is why it's often in the news. Or this is why it becomes a political issue. So then we identify a bunch of these tweets, and here's what phase two looks like. So participants basically saw this, and they said, you're going to interact with 10 other people who are also participating in this study. And then the example here says 1 and 9, and we varied this all the way from 1 and 9 on your side to 1 and 9 on the other side to 4 and 6 and 6 and 4. One person described them as being the right of the political spectrum. 9 people described them on being on the left. For each person who likes most of the tweets you share, you're going to get an additional penny. And for everyone who dislikes most of the tweets you share, you're going to lose a penny. So everyone was going to get $3.40, but they had this potential to get an additional 60 cents on either side. You win an extra 60 cents or lose an extra 60 cents. And what they were given was a whole bunch of tweets. They were all partisan tweets of their side. So if you were a right-wing participant, and we identified this ahead of time, you saw only right-wing tweets. And if you were a left-wing participant, you saw only left-wing tweets. But some were covert and some were overt. And you had to decide which ones to share. And we used real, so in phase one, people actually did in fact like and dislike tweets, right? And so what we did was we picked other participants at random, and we really used their likes and dislikes to get these payoffs. And we also, for good measure, used far right and moderate and far left and moderate left to see if there were differences in between sides. That I'm going to present results from that, but I do want to point out that the tweets were not calibrated for within partisan differences, only for between partisan differences. And fittingly, we didn't see any results within partisans between far right and moderate right and far left and moderate. But what we did find is that when we looked at cross-party differences, the more people in your group were in the out group, the more covert tweet, the higher proportion of the tweets that were selected were covert. Which means that the more likely you are to have your signal received by someone who's dissimilar from you, the more likely you are to choose a covert tweet, a covert signal to send them. And this was true for both parties and for both cost levels. So we vary the rewards you get from 60 cents on either side to 30 cents on either side. So high cost and low cost. So the main thing is we find is that more covert signaling is present in more heterogeneous groups, or when people are members of a minority. So that's good, that supports the theory. We found no effective cost. I think this is probably because there's a negligible difference between 30 cents and 60 cents. It's just not a meaningful difference to people in terms of modifying their behavior. What we find is no effective outgroup from the same party. And I think that's because the signals were not calibrated to that. So we're going to try to do that in our second study, because I do think that there is a big difference between people, how people view people who are, let's say, far right versus moderate right and far left versus moderate left. I mean, one of the things we found was that, you know, Republicans hate Democrats, but also leftists hate Democrats. Right? And then we also found that there's more covert signaling across the board by right-wing participants. And I don't know what's going on there. So if anyone has ideas, I'm happy to take them. I have no idea why. I think it's really interesting because it's pretty consistent, but I don't know what's going on. So there's some support for the idea that covert signaling is occurring in a strategic fashion on Twitter. I'm now going to just say that this does actually seem to be not just consistent with the theory, but actually strategic. So first, more discerning signalers were more strategically consistent. So this is the top and bottom quintiles and the median number of tweets shared. So people who shared a ton of tweets in the study were not discerning. They mostly just, you know, and they shared a fairly low amount of covert tweets across the board. They just shared a lot of tweets. And the people who shared very few and were discerning about how many tweets, only about 5 tweets, they were very responsive. And the more members of the outgroup there were, the more likely they were to choose covert tweets. And this paid off. So the people who were more strategically consistent got higher payoffs. So again, this is separated by how much payoff people tended to get. And the people who did the best are the ones who were most strategically consistent. And the ones who did the worst were not. Right? So this actually matters for people to be able to do. So I'll end, I'm getting to the end. So here's where I sort of take this little study and try to like think about it in terms of a larger context. And I'm not great at doing this. So it's always something that I need to, you know, spend a lot of time on and reflect on and say things that are wrong until I get it right. So I'm going to try something here. You know, when are overt signals and churlish receiving favored? So this is the opposite, right? When are overt signaling and churlish receiving favored? Well, when people exist in more homogeneous communities. If everyone's the same and most people are like you, the population is not diverse, overt signaling is favored, churlish receiving is favored. When there's an increased ability to assort with similar others, when you can just ignore people who are dissimilar from you and preferentially only interact with those who you know are like you and avoid people who are just unlike you, overt signaling is favored, churlish receiving is favored. And remember that churlish receiving means being hostile toward outsiders. That's basically what it means, right? And then when else? It's when there are reduced consequences for broadcasting differences, when the costs of interacting with someone who knows you're different are low. And I think that I see all these things increasing, all these factors increasing, at least in the US, and I think in a lot of places in the West, right? So there is more homophily and assortment. People live in neighborhoods with people who are similar to them more now than they used to. And so this is a graph from Bill Bishop's book, The Big Sort, right? So in 1976, right, there was a lot of variation between counties, within counties, on who voted for who. Whereas now people really assort with people who vote in the same way. So the white is the competitive counties in which there were election was close. You can see there's a lot fewer of them now than there were in 76. There's increased ability to assort with similar others, I think largely because of the internet. Right, so this is data on the percent of friends on Facebook who have the opposite political affiliation. And so both Republicans and Democrats tend to be friends on Facebook, mostly with other people who share the same party affiliation. And you see similar graphs like this for almost every social media network. And then reduced consequences for broadcasting differences. So, I mean, this last one is the top 5 news opinion shows as of October, right? And the top 4 are all on Fox, and the bottom is the Rachel Maddow. And this sort of supports Matt Taibbi is a journalist and makes this point in his book Hate Inc. That, you know, while he sort of likes Rachel Maddow more than Sean Hannity, that they are doing something very similar, which is promoting between group differences and partisanship. So I'm just sort of generally worried about all this. And I think the point that I take, one of the points that I take from this work, at least at this stage, is that the ability to signal covertly, you know, whether, you know, that's it takes the form of politeness or discreetness, right, is actually the sign of a healthy, diverse population. If we're going to have a diverse population in which different people interact, there needs to be ways for them to interact that enables them to function without exacerbating their differences. And if that doesn't happen, right, I'm not saying, so this is, it's not, what I want to say here is not normative, right? I'm not saying this is how people should behave. I'm saying it is a sign of the fact that people do behave in this way is a sign of a healthy, diverse population. And the sign of people not behaving that way is a sign of a population which is fractured, and in which people interact mostly with others who are similar to them and avoid people who are dissimilar to them. And this is ongoing work. There's going to be more empirical work and more modeling work on this. I feel like this is a project that I'm increasingly passionate about and want to take further. So I'm extremely excited and happy to get feedback from you. And that's all I have. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for a great talk. Super interesting, and love the empirical data there at the end, the Twitter data. I imagine we'll have some questions. So the best way to do that, if you don't mind, maybe unsharing your screen, Paul, and then I can see more people.
Great.
And if you need to share it again to show data or something, we can do that. But so let me remind everyone to the easiest way to raise your hand is using the raise hand option, which I do believe is under participants. And there's a raise hand button, which will show me a blue hand. And then I'll take a list and call on people in order. So first question comes from Anne. Hi, Anne.
Hi, thanks. Nice to see you, Paul.
Hey, Anne, nice to see you too.
So my question is about with the models, and I'm sorry I came a few minutes late from another meeting, so I'm sorry if I missed it, but it seems like a common assumption that was really important to the various models that you presented in the first part was that it's important for the individual's success to find each other, or to assort with similar people. And so I was just wondering how you perceive that assumption, because I could imagine circumstances where that's not actually as important, and that might be part of the potential solution to some of these societal issues we're facing. But I don't know, like, I guess, can you say a little bit more about your thoughts on whether that's something you would explore further, or whether you could defend that that's a really solid assumption?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a really good question. And I don't think I really touched on that. So I mean, I did say that I'm going to focus on that and not the other types. And I sort of mentioned at the beginning that there are other sort of important things for assortment other than similarity. So, I mean, the model focuses a little bit on, it focuses on homophily, which is the ability to assort with similar others, but it assumes that assorting with similar others is always good. And I think that that is the case in most situations, at least to some extent. Like, there are definitely scenarios in which it's really important to have complementary rather than, correlated backgrounds or interests or skills, right? Like, you want people who, bring different things to the table rather than have the same. But I think even then, even in those cases, there does need to be some sort of underlying similarity and ability to communicate and coordinate. You need to sort of agree on what the goal is and what would be good and what would not be good, right? Rather, even if we're, using different, approaches to get there. So I think there's always some background to that, but I mean, I would love to. I think there's a lot of richness in this kind of thing, in which, I feel like I've just kind of scratched the surface here. So if you can think of any, then I'm happy to.
Thanks for the answer. No, I didn't have any thoughts to begin with, but then as you were answering, I was thinking about some of PJ's work showing, and I know he's here, so he could correct me if I'm misinterpreting it, but showing some circumstances in which you could model sort of success in certain circumstances being more easy to achieve with a diverse group of participants. So I wonder if there's a possibility to think about it that way. But yeah, thanks for your answer. I see other people have their hands up, so I'll cede the floor. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.
And are you thinking about like, is it like wisdom of the crowds type of thing that you're thinking about there with like diversity?
Possibly. I mean, I'd really be curious to see what PJ thinks since I'm talking about his stuff, but.
Well, let me just say, I mean, I'm familiar with some of PJ's work and with Scott Page's work on this kind of thing. And I like that work a lot. And but so that's kind of what I was trying to get at is like, I think even with that kind of work, there is still an assumption that individuals communicate effectively and have shared goals. And most of that work is on, at least that I'm aware of, is on diversity in backgrounds, diversity in knowledge, but the goals are still the same. So I think that's the level at which I guess I'm thinking of.
Yeah, I think my intuition and my intuition is also that it makes sense to assume that you need to have some base level of shared something, but that might be something you could also vary and see what the consequences would be.
Yeah, fair.
Great point, great question. Okay, let's take a question from Dan.
Hi, Paul.
Hey, Dan.
Great talk. So I'm thinking about churlish receivers and what their impacts on the dynamics are. And in part, it seems is really important what constitutes no information. And in particular, it seems to me that when there are prevalent, costly, churlish receivers in the population, what it actually is going to select for is what you might call the Pixar effect, right? So, starting, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, family movie companies started producing movies that are funny at two levels, right? So that the kids think they're funny and the adults are getting all these allusions to, generational culture that just go right over the kids' heads. So it's not that, and this is, this is not a parallel to a dog whistle. So a dog whistle is an apparently innocuous remark that is interpretable by those who have the encryption key, right? But what you might call the Pixar effect is there is what appears to be an informative remark, but there is actually a covert, even more informative remark underneath that for those who have the encryption key, right? And I think that's what prevalent churlish receivers should be selecting for. People will become more sophisticated so that they're actually speaking at one level to the general audience to avoid the costs of churlish receivers in a way that seems informative, but hidden within that is a covert message to the intended coordination partners that is invisible to the churlish receivers who are on the outgroup.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that at one level, the model is kind of doing that, which is in the sense that the idea is that the churlish receivers are able to, actually, let me take that back.
I don't think your model does it because
yeah, no, you're right. It doesn't. It doesn't do it. So I've thought about that a bit. It's as well. I'll just say I think that there's a lot more. I mean, the simple answer is there's a lot more modeling to be done. I would love to do something like that because I think that there's a lot more nuance there. I do think that there are kinds of scenarios, right, in which the churlish receiver is basically looking for a sign of positive information that, yes, you are sending me signaling that I like, and if I don't see it, I don't like it. And if that's the kind of churlish receiver that is in the model. But there's another kind of churlish receiver, right, that is triggered by a certain kind of information that in the absence of can still get some information that they like. And on one hand, that's our generous receivers, right? If there's no information that I dislike, then I'm okay with you. Then we still can interact on a sort of sub-threshold level or a suboptimal level, but still well, because I can maintain a neutral attitude to you. I think what you're getting at is sort of multiple levels of this, where it's not just all or none, churlish or generous, but in fact, you could sort of signal to the aspects that I'm, in which we're similar and avoid the aspects in which we're different.
I think it's an arms race. It's an arms race between signaler and receiver, where when there are churlish receivers out there, the signalers for whom the churlish are in the out group are designing messages that appear to provide information to the churlish receiver, but actually are even more informative to the in-group intended target. And then the churlish receiver in turn should be attempting to become more sophisticated to detect that deception.
Okay, I see what you're saying now. Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I think we'd have to get yeah, we'd need a more sophisticated model to explore that, but I think that's a really interesting idea. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Let's next take a question from Renee.
Hi, I'm actually wondering now what I should still ask my question because it's very much related to what Dan just said already, or at least I think it is. Because I was wondering to what extent your model depends on individuals from the same group understanding, well, maybe this is different from what Dan said. Individuals from the same group understanding the covert signals. And because I think this is something that you did vary in your model, but maybe maybe you could speak a little bit towards how the specific covert signals that individuals might use could evolve. That's it.
That's a great question. So yeah, in the model, the model is like totally agnostic as to what the signals are and what the mechanisms for actually signaling are, what form that they take, what modalities they're in, and also, what the sort of receptive mechanisms are and how they're perceived, et cetera. One of the things, I think so we discussed this a bit in the new paper at the end, just sort of like some freewheeling discussion of what might be the case or what might happen. One of the things, though, that I think of a lot is that in reality, I think covert signals are, almost certainly not going to be static for exactly the reason I think you're hinting at. And I think for a similar reason to what Dan was just talking about, is that if it's valuable to you to know what I'm saying, and I'm using a covert signal that is designed for you not to know what I'm saying, eventually you're probably going to figure out what I'm saying if I keep using the same signal. And so I think that there's almost certainly going to be a transition from signals that emerge as covert signals and then become overt signals as their meaning becomes widely known among outgroup members. And so it'll create selection for a constant cycling. It reminds me, if anyone is familiar with Georg Simmel's paper Fashion, or related work, right, that talks about sort of this chase and flight between fashions among an elite that is trying to differentiate themselves from the rabble, and the rabble who's trying to emulate the elite, right? That's his idea of why you get these cycles of fashion. I think something similar is probably happening with covert signals, in which signals, they start out, there needs to be some amount of coordination between members of an in-group to even know what it means. Right? And so a signal is going to initially spread among members of a community that have these shared interests. And as long as it sort of is maintained within that community, it serves effectively, it can eventually pass the threshold of adoption, serves as an effective covert signal. But if it spreads beyond the in-group, it becomes an overt signal. And it's not binary like in the model, right? It's probabilistic. Yeah. Someone who's like, well, someone there, people like Jacob Foster or Bernard Koch there could probably do a great job on that kind of idea. But yeah, I think that's super interesting.
Well, thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. Next, let's take a question from Brian Wood.
That was a fantastic talk, Paul, and thanks for giving us so much insight into this fertile area that you're exploring here. And there's, like you said, there's so much potential here for multiple ways to expand all this work. I was wondering, you didn't mention this in your intro, but I don't think it's because you're not thinking about these things, but I was wondering if you've looked at research sort of to contextualize this, thinking about signaling animal communication theory and communication in non-human species, where you could, all the dynamics that you're describing and the sort of the ecology that you're describing could certainly arise, for example, in prey species that are trying to signal to one another to maintain group contact but not be detected by predators. And other forms of situations where there's a value to remaining covert. Is there anything in that field that you think is relevant to your work, or a direction that you could think would be worth exploring, or anything along those lines?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and thanks for the comment more generally. Yeah, I love the animal communication, animal signaling literature, and it's so rich, and there are great models and great examples. There's a lot of really neat examples of encrypted signals in the animal communication literature for exactly the kind of thing you're talking about, or things like things like mate search, or there's also great stuff on deception. The covert signaling idea in particular is like, it's pretty geared toward a sort of a species that is highly cooperative with strangers. Yeah. With individuals who are sort of, what Mark Moffat calls anonymous societies, right? There's the idea that we have individuals who we don't necessarily know, but we are potentially willing to work with them. Yeah. And so there may be, if there was anything like that it would probably, to me, the most likely candidates seem like the eusocial insects. I'm not, actually, I was just emailing with Mark. I should ask him about that. Yeah, I don't know of any particular examples that are like close enough to this. But I'm very receptive.
Yeah. Well, just because I've got your attention here, I thought I'd mention one case that, you know, so much of what you've written on this echoes in this area. And selfishly, I'm trying to find a good way to cite you and other people who are working on this issue. But in the case of indigenous hunters who are trying to communicate with one another in a situation in which there's multiple eavesdroppers, some of which you are trying to actually hunt or not be detected by. In the case of human indigenous hunters, there's a widespread tradition of using whistles and other forms of communicating. That's when I talk, the Hadza do this, when I talk to them about it, they say the reason why we use whistles is because we sound like birds. And so what it does is it prevents the prey species that they're hunting from being able to detect them. And because of this idea that the high frequency sounds that they are using kind of are more like background noise of birds chattering to one another. And so they encrypt their communication in that way. That's what they tell me is the intent. And I think, yeah, this is pretty widespread also in military training that I'm aware, that I've heard of, is certain kinds of you know, local shifts in communication like that to try to. Anyway, I just thought that it sort of your work sort of echoes in those areas.
No, thank you for that. And if I need to look up any specific work on it. If you have anything specific on,
I'll definitely send you some stuff. I will definitely send you some stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just say quickly, like, I mean, that to me it's still, we're still talking about humans, at least on one end. And I think it's because, you know, we have this extremely sophisticated communication system, which is sort of, I think, like a quantum leap above other species. But that's a really cool example, because in that case, the people you're trying to avoid, you know, are not other potential interaction partners, but, you know, on the one hand, military enemies, and on the other hand, prey species. I mean, I think this is, as you said, like a well-documented phenomenon in a lot of cases, but it's neat. I hadn't thought about that connection before, so thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Great. Okay, thanks. How about let's take a question from Andrew. Andrew.
Hi. So thanks for a really interesting talk. I wanted to ask you a little bit about sort of explore in a little bit greater depth the point you had raised about right-leaning individuals engaging in more, covert signaling more generally. And I was wondering if you had any evidence in your data about sort of a hierarchical structure or order in which some of these signals are presented as a means of, gating conversations about some topics that are sort of, maybe valenced as negative. And so by doing this sort of thing, you can get like increasingly increased assurance that the person you might be talking to is going to be on board with some of the like more distasteful ideas that you might be sort of hinting at, but not actually feel safe to say in a public domain. Does that make any sense?
I think so. So I'm not. We're kind of in the process right now in this particular case of like poring over like the mechanisms by which our Twitter data was our tweets initially were selected, to see if there's any sort of maybe qualitative differences in the nature of the tweets. It just may be that like The right-wing tweets are more appealing, let's say. I know that we had fewer right-wing participants on MTurk. Like MTurk skews left. So it may be because just of the nature of the network, right, that if they're on MTurk, right-wing individuals are more in the minority in that community than left-wing individuals. So their baseline level of covert signaling is going to be higher. I mean, that seems possible. There's some interesting research sort of indicating that, you know, people in the US, at least on the political right, tend to be more churlish than individuals on the political left, which kind of makes sense in the sense that, like, the political right in this country is much more uniform and has kind of a very kind of, at least a relatively clear-cut platform, whereas the left is much more demographically and ideologically diverse. It's much more of a big tent party. So that you would almost expect in that case the opposite, based on the US population as a whole. So my gut is that it has more to do with either the particular sample that we used and or the particular tweets that we had available.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Great. If I might ask a question, Paul, this is maybe an ill-formed question, but I was so interested in your comment that in some ways, the more overt signaling that you see in a society, that sort of indicates a fractured, politically fractured or a group fractured society. And I was wondering about the direction of causation there. I haven't fully grasped how your models work, but in some ways, the natural thing would be to assume that, you have political fracturing, which then leads to more overt signaling. But I'm reminded of all these discussions that people are having now about how we've reached the political point that we have in the US. And a lot of people talk about Gingrich, people like that in the Reagan era, who changed, intentionally changed the kinds of things you could say, right? And now we have Roger Stone takes credit for this partly, and then Trump is doing it. So, one of the things that you saw with Trump is that he said a lot of things overtly that previously would have thought would have been things that you would have said covertly. Of course, he does use dog whistles and things like that, but he's also incredibly overt with some of the stuff that he says, like sometimes beyond what would have been previously considered acceptable. And then, so there's been this discussion of that started with Gingrich and those people saying, let's just do attack ads. Like attack ads weren't sort of considered okay in politics at a certain point. And then in the Reagan era, they became acceptable and then just ramped up like extremely. And I was wondering, so there seems to be some dynamics there. And I was wondering what you think about that. Like, are the dynamics driven by like changes in what kind of speech is acceptable? Or is it sort of the other way around? Or is there any way to tell?
What a great question. So in the model, it's the things like homogeneity or homophily is just an exogenous factor, right? It's unchanging, and it assumes that people signal to each other and receives those signals just in the context of that information. Right? Every time I think about this, there's I'm really glad you asked that question, because there's always like kind of this looming other thing that's hanging over there that I generally avoid talking about when I present this stuff, but it's there. And to me, it's not just the political actors, but it's the media, right? It's the fact that, in the US and in many other countries, like our media is owned by corporate conglomerates that have political agendas. And, I think that like Noam Chomsky is like manufacturing consent all the time in terms of the media, in terms of how, the media and the gatekeepers on sort of who is allowed to be on air and who is promoted shape the conversation that's even had. And what happens when you have something like the internet And I mean, it started probably with, at least with cable. And so that's where, you know, the Gingrich initially comes out of. But then you have cable TV, you have, you know, the internet, you have social media, you have smartphones, all of which creates this landscape, not just for, you know, dominance from one media conglomerate to shape the social conversation, but also for fragmentation, because it's profitable to fragment people. So I think that this is a huge backdrop to this. And at least in the situation in the US, like, it's not like the directionality of the interplay between individual behaviors and sort of social strategies and the sort of media landscape and the economic landscape, it's all entangled in a way that I feel like I'm still very much trying to wrap my head around.
Yeah, but on the other hand, it seems like these sort of population models that have changed over time seem ideal for trying to get at that entangled causation, right? Because it's a dynamical system, and they're not necessarily prime movers, right?
So this, yeah, I mean, in a sort of slow and I guess orbital way, this is very much the kind of thing that I'm trying to do more of going forward. Yeah.
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 Cool.
Thanks.
Cool. Thank you. I see that Dan has his hand up.
Yeah, it was sort of following up on that point, which is, it seems to me that one of the things that favors churlishness is coalitional conflict. So you framed it in terms of, you know, homophily and coordination, but anytime that you have zero-sum contests, then churlishness will be favored because you demand indications from potential in-group members that they're committed to the conflict with the out-group. And there could well be differences between the right and the left in the US today in terms of the extent to which they see, you know, sort of existential threat in the out-group's potential success. And if that's the case, then you would expect more churlishness on the right than on the left. And you would expect signalers to understand that and to respond accordingly.
Yeah. So I do expect more churlishness on the right than the left. Yeah, for exactly that reason, and for related reasons. As that we found in the one study, but again, I don't take that as representative of the American right and left. The general point, though, I mean, I think that's a really good point, and I think it's still like, I think it's still consistent with the model in the sense that we're talking about mechanisms for homophilic assortment. So if it's really important to interact with members of the in-group effectively, right, versus and you're able to do so, then you should definitely expect that. There's another factor, right, which is I've actually been thinking a lot that you probably are aware of this. Like Larry Iannacone has this stuff on sacrifice and stigma about kind of signals. He's mostly focusing on religious groups, but like, you know, putting yourself out there in a way that would stigmatize you to members of the outgroup to reinforce in-group solidarity. And I think this is very much entangled. It's not in the model, but it's something that I've been thinking a lot about and how it would be important to bring into future models.
Yeah, well, what overt signals do in situations of coalitional conflict is they're commitment devices, right? You can't feign neutrality or, you know, switch sides if you have, you know, a committing overt signal. And so, this is why, you know, prison gangs, you know, facial tattooing is something that spreads across, you know, there's cultural diffusion of the practice across rival lines, right? It forces that, and then that's going to co-evolve with churlishness, right? That people will demand those signals, and that those are situations of, you know, zero-sum coalitional conflict.
I guess I'm slightly uncomfortable with the use of the word zero sum there, because I think it's more complicated than that. But in general, I agree with you. Yeah, I mean, I agree. Overt signals. I don't think overt signals are always commitment devices. Well, no, I mean, I guess in a sense they clearly are. So the question then is, how strong is that commitment, and what does it cost you?
It's a great question. What was the book that you showed us?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is I
Can't,
didn't know if Dan's alluding to it or not, or just more generally, because I mean, Dan knows a lot of things, but this is Diego Gambetta's Codes of the Underworld: How Criminals Communicate.
oh, wow.
This book is awesome. It's Gambetta is he's a game theorist, he's a sociologist, and it's full of great examples of communication in organized crime and in prison populations, with exactly the kinds of dynamics that Dan was just talking about, as well as others.
Yeah. Cool. I guess if nobody else has a question, Brian, do you still have your hand up, but are you done? Okay. I'll ask one more question unless anyone else wants to jump in. So you were I've thought about this while you're talking, and I'm not totally sure the answer, so this is probably going to be vague. But I'm thinking about the distinction between when there was something a little bit jarring when you started out saying identity as a signal. I mean, I do understand that one can signal one's identity, but I guess I'm thinking of, you know, the way that a lot of social scientists would think about identity is that a lot of aspects of our identity are not chosen by us. And I was wondering about that conflict in the way that you've set this up, because I guess in one sense you could say, well, the agent's identities are not chosen by them, but that what they're choosing to do is whether and how to signal.
How to signal that? Yeah, I did do some conflating of those things at the beginning, so I'm thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I don't really see a problem with it. I was just wondering, you know, to what extent it plays a role in, I mean, is there a...
Well, it's one of the reasons why I mentioned, when I talk about minorities, I'm very clear to talk about invisible minorities, right? Because there are some aspects of our identity which are not invisible, which can't be invisible. And that's, you can't, you know, it's, I mean, there are still even examples, right? I mean, if you talk about like passing for light-skinned African Americans in the 20th century, like that's a kind of, you know, it's a kind of choice of how to signal one's identity, even though there's still an overt signal. But yeah, it's very entangled. I mean, I think of yeah, I mean, I'm getting slightly flustered because I think identity is so complicated and such a, to me, I think it's such an interesting facet of our lives. But you're right, it's so much about like, it's how we perceive ourselves and how others perceive us in relationship to others. So like, yeah, there are things like racial identity, for example, but racial identity is determined not just by like the color of our skin or our physical attributes, but also like what else, you know, what the diversity of the culture is, how different characteristics are viewed, etc. And there are still elements of those, you know, even with things that are unhideable, we can sort of choose which things to augment and which things to downplay.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of one of the reasons I was thinking about these bidirectional dynamics, because I mean, in one way you could think, I mean, your model makes perfect sense as one where you would think, okay, the rules of the system are kind of set up. The agents don't choose the rules of the system, right? And then you're modeling, you know, how they choose to signal within the constraints that have been imposed on them, right? Like they don't choose their characteristics or anything like that. But that's why I started thinking of, you know, then you have these interesting things where it seems like, you know, we were talking about some examples where agents make choices to actually reveal some aspects of their identity in sort of agentic ways that then actually seem to change the rules of the game in some way, like the political thing I was, you know, talking about, or cases where a minority group is sort of like tries to conceal their identity to outgroup members, but then they make a conscious choice of now we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to be overt about our identity. And then that seems to change the landscape, you know, in a lot of cases. So it's not really a question, but I'm just curious. It seems like a great framework to model these things.
Yeah, I'll just say, yes, I agree. It is, yeah, I feel like there's a lot to do, and I'm chiseling away at it. And if anyone is interested in doing any work, either modeling or empirical on this kind of stuff, please get in touch with me. I'm definitely looking for expand the network a bit.
That's
so,
great.
Yeah.
That's a great invitation, and we're all looking forward to seeing where you take this. It's super interesting. I guess on that note, we are up against the end of our allotted time. So let's all thank Paul for a really exciting talk. Paul, thanks for coming to visit.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for sharing this work. It's really, really, really thought-provoking, and I'm sure it'll generate a lot of discussions going forward. So
Cool.
Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah. Hope to hear from you soon.
All right, everyone. I'll see you all next week for Manveer Singh's talk, same time, same place. Take care. Let me end this recording.